Hey guys, tonight we step barefoot onto the hot sands of ancient Egypt, where the sun scorches your back, the Nile murmurs beside papyrus reeds, and just around that temple wall, a fertility priest is chanting over a pair of clay figurines in compromising positions. You've time traveled to a place where sex wasn't just for pleasure or procreation, it was divine, political, magical, and occasionally, unhygienic. You inhale incense thick enough to glue your nostrils shut, while barefoot dancers whirl to the beat of hand drums. Somewhere nearby, lovers whisper promises under fig trees, and in the shadows of monuments, desires take shape. Sex is everywhere, painted on tomb walls, tucked into love poems, scrawled in workmen's graffiti. And it's never just personal. It's religious. It's medicinal. It's cosmic. Of course, you'll be stepping into spaces where beliefs were different, very different. And fair warning, you probably won't survive this trip without at least reconsidering your views on crocodiles. Or onions. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and what time you're listening. I love seeing how far this little campfire reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk toward the Nile, toes sinking into soft earth. This is Kemet, the Black Land, named for the fertile floodplains that cradle it like a goddess cradles a child. And in this rich soil, Egypt's entire cosmology blooms, tangled with the erotic and the sacred. See, in ancient Egypt, sex wasn't something hidden in bedrooms or buried in taboos. It was life. Literally. Creation itself was a sexual act, and not just metaphorically. One of their earliest myths tells you that the universe began when the creator god Adam pleasured himself on the primordial mound and, in doing so, released the first gods into existence. That's right, the world came into being via a divine solo session. Modern theologians might shuffle awkwardly at that origin story, but Egyptians celebrated it. They weren't squeamish about pleasure, they saw it as sacred, an echo of divine forces at play. It's why fertility and agricultural abundance were so deeply connected. Seeds and wombs weren't all that different in the Egyptian worldview. You crouched beside a basin in a temple, watching a priest stir water with a carved ivory wand. The water's to be poured over statues of Min, the god of virility. If you're imagining a statue of a serene, dignified deity, try again. Min is, well, let's just say the defining feature of his anatomy is visible from across the courtyard. This god doesn't leave things to the imagination. Egyptians placed lettuce offerings beneath him, not because Min had a salad obsession, but because lettuce was believed to stimulate arousal. It's also why some fertility festivals involve public displays you'd absolutely get banned for today. Historians still argue whether these rituals included symbolic reenactments of divine union, or full-on sacred intimacy between priestesses and stand-in gods. Either way, you weren't going to one of these temples for the incense. You move through a village at dusk, where homes flicker with oil lamps. Through open doorways, couples share bread and beer, children play, and elders lean back with sleepy smiles. This is domestic life, but even here, traces of sexual belief creep in. Married couples were expected to be affectionate, and love poetry wasn't rare. It was mass-produced on papyrus and passed around like ancient Egyptian mixtapes. You might even stumble across a workman's hut near Deir el-Medina, the village that built the Valley of the Kings. Here, on the walls, you'd see graffiti that's basically 3,000-year-old locker room talk. One drawing shows a woman playing a harp while receiving divine attention from a very enthusiastic man. Another scribble reads like a sweet, if awkward, pickup line. You are like the sycamore fig, sweet in my mouth. You try that one on your next date. And yet, amid all this openness, there were rules. Sex was natural, yes, but it wasn't a free-for-all. Marriage was sacred. Adultery could wreck reputations. Women had autonomy, sure, but social class mattered. A noblewoman's affair might be scandalous, a servant's would be forgotten. And while the gods might get away with wild escapades, humans were expected to exercise some restraint. Still, restraint didn't mean shame. Egyptian culture didn't demonize the body. They mummified it, preserved it, adorned it. Your body wasn't a prison for the soul. It was a temple that housed a spark of divine essence. Keeping it healthy, clean, and yes, sexually satisfied, was part of honoring that divinity. You sip cool beer from a ceramic jar, listening to villagers gossip under the stars. Somewhere, someone's playing a flute. The air smells of lotus flowers and the Nile's soft rot. You begin to understand how deeply this land blurred the lines between sensuality and survival. Without love, without sex, there is no family, no afterlife lineage, no offering bowls filled by descendants. It's not a luxury. It's your soul's ticket to eternity. But if you think this is all soft kisses and perfume, well, you haven't met the gods yet. They're about to make mortal passion look tame. You wake with the gods. Or rather, you wake in a world where the gods are watching. Always. And not from some distant cloud either. They're in your food, your breath, your dreams, and yes, your sex life. So when you catch Bastet's mischievous eyes painted on a temple wall, you start to wonder if the feline goddess is judging your love life, or just smirking at it. Let's talk about divine intimacy. In the Egyptian pantheon, the gods have needs, carnal ones. They flirt, fight, seduce, and even get a little incestuous, which would send modern family therapists into cardiac arrest. But in ancient cosmology, divine unions weren't dirty. They were sacred allegories for creation, balance, and cosmic order. You stand in awe at the temple of Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, and music. She's often pictured with cow ears and a sun disk between her horns. But don't let the farm aesthetic fool you. This goddess is a full-blown heartthrob. Egyptians worshipped her with music, dance, and wine. Think of her as the original party host, whose gatherings might end with a bit more than just singing. Then there's her on-again, off-again love story with Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship. One myth has her helping him recover after a brutal fight by bearing her, a hem, chest. Not just a distraction, her breasts were healing symbols. Divine comfort food, if you will. Speaking of Horus, he and his uncle Seth, god of chaos and sandstorms, had one of the most bizarre confrontations in mythic history. Historians still argue whether their infamous seed battle was symbolic or meant to be taken literally. In short, Seth tries to dominate Horus, sexually. But Horus, being a clever trickster, turns the tables in a way that leaves Seth red-faced and the gods chuckling. If you're confused, don't worry, so are most Egyptologists. The takeaway? Even divine power struggles had erotic undertones. Now shift your gaze to Nut and Geb, the sky and the earth. Lovers eternally separated by the air god Shu, forced to pine for each other from above and below. Every evening, Nut swallows the sun, and every morning, gives birth to it again. That's not just a poetic cycle, it's deeply sensual. Every sunrise is a divine rebirth, born of longing between separated lovers. But not all stories are tender. Take Isis and Osiris, Egypt's ultimate power couple. After Osiris is murdered and chopped into pieces by jealous Seth, Isis collects his body parts, all except one. Guess which part was missing? Yep. The important bit. So what does Isis do? She crafts a magical phallus and conceives their son, Horus, through it. That's some next-level DIY fertility magic. This myth wasn't just bedtime folklore, it was a religious cornerstone. Osiris's resurrection via Isis's love was proof that sex, death, and rebirth were eternally linked. Without their union, the afterlife system wouldn't even function. Your resurrection would be cancelled. No refund. As you walk through incense-hazed temples, you realize Egyptian gods weren't remote moral judges. They were complicated, often messy, deeply human-like in their desires. And people mirrored them. If a god could love, cheat, and get resurrected via a prosthetic organ, who are you to feel shame about lust? Even the architecture nods to divine sensuality. Temples of Karnak and Luxor are aligned with solar positions, yes, but also designed with phallic symbolism. The towering obelisks? Giant stone fertility symbols, reaching for the sky like an eternal aspiration. And in Luxor Temple, some scholars argue the entire layout symbolizes the union of a male and female form, walls and columns as body parts, guiding worshippers through a metaphorical act of cosmic coupling. You pass through the avenue of sphinxes, and it's not just about grandeur. The sphinx itself, lion body, human head, is a fusion creature, a hybrid of forces. Egyptians loved dualities. Male and female, God and human, creation and destruction. Sex, in this worldview, was the bridge between those opposites. And while Egypt was no stranger to ritual sex, it wasn't usually casual. When it did happen in temples, it had rules, roles, symbolism, and consequences. The said festival, for instance, celebrated a king's continued virility and power through ritual performances that might include sexual acts, though details remain disputed. Was it symbolic? Private? Or literal? No one agrees. But the implication is clear. Staying kingly meant staying active. In your stroll through myth, you come across the scrolls of the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings on earth. They're filled with references to bodily fluids as sacred life force. One passage has the dead king mounting the heavens with his phallus, as a wild bull, fertilizing the stars. Not subtle. But again, not obscene. This was theology in action. Now, let's touch lightly on taboo. Certain divine acts today might raise eyebrows, especially those involving siblings or self-pleasure. But for Egyptians, these were part of divine order. Adam creating life through himself was self-sufficiency, not sin. Isis marrying her brother Osiris was balance, not scandal. Morality wasn't about repression, it was about maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic harmony. Even so, priests had to remain ritually pure. That didn't mean celibate, necessarily, but they did follow strict cleansing routines. Sex before sacred duties? Off limits. But outside of those hours? No written rule says they couldn't flirt by the Nile. You pause to listen to a temple hymn, sung softly by acolytes in white linen. It's not just praise, it's a love poem to a god's form, full of longing, scent, taste. You wonder if ancient worshippers ever felt embarrassed singing these lines. Probably not. When sex is divine, desire becomes devotion. As the sun dips behind obelisks, shadows stretch long and soft. The gods retreat into starlight, leaving behind their stories etched in stone, whispered in reeds, and hinted at in every grain of golden sand. You've only just met them, but already they've made it clear, in Egypt, even divinity had a libido. You wake to the scent of crushed lotus petals. The village is already stirring. Somewhere, a donkey brays. A baker is pulling flatbread from a clay oven. And just over the wall, a young woman slips a dab of perfume behind her ear, hums to herself, and adjusts her best linen dress, creased just so to suggest she didn't mean to impress anyone. You smirk. Subtlety isn't exactly the goal this morning. Love, in ancient Egypt, isn't just a divine concept, it's something lived. Something very human. And you're about to witness how people flirted, courted, and tied the knot in a world before dating apps, but with a surprisingly sophisticated sense of romance. You stroll into a courtyard shaded by sycamores. Two young men practice wrestling nearby, but keep stealing glances toward a pair of girls weaving garlands. You don't speak the language, but the body language? Universal. A glance too long. A smile held a beat. Love, it turns out, is a language older than hieroglyphs. And while modern historians can only guess at how much of this was casual versus serious, ancient Egyptian love poetry paints a vivid picture. You find a fragment of verse, preserved on crumbling papyrus. It reads like something out of a high school notebook, except with fewer metaphors and more dates involving fruit baskets. My love is one, only one, the best of all. Look, he comes walking on the road, like the moon. I rush outside to see him. A little dramatic? Sure. But when you live in a mud brick home and the Nile's your Netflix, passion becomes your favorite drama. Dating wasn't institutionalized the way marriage was, but that didn't mean it didn't exist. Courtship likely happened at festivals, markets, temple gatherings, anywhere eyes could meet and fingers could brush. Accidentally. And while we can't ask them directly, The prevalence of love poems and flirty graffiti tells you that casual affection was alive and well. One joke carved on a pottery shard reads, "She passed me once and I became a goose." It's not Shakespeare, but it gets the point across. Of course, flirtation wasn't gender exclusive. Women could initiate, tease, pursue. Egyptian art often shows women in dominant postures, holding men's arms, guiding their hands. It's subtle but revolutionary for its time. Historians still debate just how much social power women had romantically, but the imagery paints a picture of mutual desire, not obedience. And then there's the smell. You pause at a stall in the market. A perfumer is mashing myrrh and resin, stirring it into a base of animal fat. Egyptians were scent-obsessed. They oiled their bodies daily, not just to mask the heat, but as part of attraction. A good lover smelled like lotus, frankincense, maybe a whisper of cinnamon. Bad breath? They chewed natron and herbs. There were no excuses. When two people decided to settle down, things got more formal, but not too formal. Unlike Roman or modern religious weddings, ancient Egyptian marriages were often simple agreements. No priests. No vows. Just two people, sometimes their families, and maybe a written contract if they were wealthy. Most of the time, it was as easy as moving in together. You wander into a modest home where a newlywed couple arranges furniture. She's brought her mirror and coal pot. He's brought a jar of beer and probably his mother's opinion. There might be a little ceremony, a feast, a few prayers to Hathor or Bes, but the bond itself is mostly social. What mattered wasn't pomp, it was harmony. Property agreements were another story. Marriage contracts could be incredibly detailed, especially among elites. They outlined who brought what into the home, what happened in case of divorce, and who got custody of, well, goats, probably. In some, women negotiated full control over their dowries or inheritance. Empowering? Certainly. Though, again, this varied by status. Not everyone was free to marry as they pleased. Class and family approval mattered. A craftsman's daughter might dream of a scribe, but the scribe's mother might have other plans. Even so, you get the feeling that love had a way of sneaking around barriers. Kind of like how two lovers are sneaking glances from behind laundry lines across this courtyard right now. Let's talk gifts. Jewelry was the go-to romantic currency. Men gave women rings, beads, amulets. Not just pretty, they were protective. Giving someone a heart scarab wasn't just romantic, it meant, "I want your soul safe forever." Kind of makes modern flowers feel lazy. Sex itself? It was part of love, obviously. But it wasn't expected to be hidden. Bedrooms were usually shared with extended family, separated by curtains or low walls. Privacy wasn't a guarantee. That said, Egyptian art often shows couples in affectionate poses, sitting close, arm over shoulder. It's more about intimacy than exposure. One fringe tidbit you stumble across involves kissing. There's debate on whether the ancient Egyptians kissed on the mouth. Few explicit depictions survive, and some scholars think nose-rubbing or cheek contact was more common. Others say, nah, they definitely smooched. So, for now, you're stuck imagining a lot of very intense nose cuddling. And what about same-sex love? Ancient texts are hush-hush, but the tale of Horus and Seth, remember the seed scandal, suggests awareness of male-male relations. There's also the famous tomb of Nyanknum and Khnumhotep, two male officials buried together, their noses touching in the same intimate pose used for married couples. Historians still argue whether they were brothers or lovers, but either way, the tenderness is unmistakable. You pass a wall painting where a woman whispers into a man's ear. He's laughing, and you suddenly feel like you're intruding. Then again, maybe they want you to see. Egyptians weren't shy about affection. To love was to live. To touch was to remember that death was always near. So tonight, as you lie in the dark listening to distant reed flutes, remember, whether it was a whispered poem, a lotus tucked behind the ear, or an amulet pressed into the palm, the Egyptians knew that romance wasn't just a pastime, it was a kind of spell. A drumbeat echoes through the valley, steady and slow, like a heartbeat beneath the desert. You follow it. past adobe walls, through palm-lined courtyards, into the torchlit depths of a sacred temple complex. The air smells of myrrh and melted beeswax. You pass dancers smeared in ochre, their hips swaying with purposeful rhythm. The festival is underway. And not just any festival. This is one of Egypt's lesser-spoken secrets. Rituals where pleasure and piety entwine, where sacred ecstasy brings you closer to the gods. Let's just say you're not going to hear this part in a middle school history class. At first glance, things seem almost ordinary. You see processions, singing offerings. Priests carry images of gods, their heads bowed beneath gold. But linger longer, and you'll feel the pulse shift. It's in the way the dancers move, hip rolls that last a fraction too long, the sidelong glances between young initiates, the laughter that builds into something less innocent. You're witnessing one of Egypt's more sensual, religious festivals, like the Feast of Hathor or the Festival of Drunkenness. These weren't quiet prayer circles. These were all-night affairs where music, wine, incense, and dancing were believed to dissolve the barriers between mortals and divinity. One popular myth explains the origin: Hathor, enraged and bloodthirsty, almost destroys humanity. But Ra tricks her into drinking beer dyed red to look like blood. She gets drunk, forgets her rage, and becomes joyful once more. So now, each year, Egyptians celebrate this divine hangover cure with, well, a party. And it wasn't just symbolic. Wine flowed, inhibitions lowered, and spiritual merging happened, sometimes literally. Historians still debate how far these rites went. Some suggest sexual acts took place within temple walls as part of fertility invocations. Others insist it was metaphorical, spiritual unification, not physical. You, standing here amid the swirl of bodies and heat, aren't entirely sure either. One temple relief from Dendera shows naked priestesses dancing in honor of Hathor. Another fragment from a workers' village shows pairs of figures, blessing each other in postures that, let's say, aren't exactly handshakes. Scholars tiptoe around it, but the evidence is there. Ritual sexuality existed, though likely reserved for specific moments and roles. Not everyone could participate, of course. Most people just danced, sang, and maybe made poor wine decisions. But for those chosen, priestesses of Hathor, attendants of Min, ritual consorts, the act of sex itself could become sacred. A reenactment of divine creation. A performance so powerful it was said to sustain the cosmic order. You wander into a side chamber filled with statues of the god Min again. Yep, the guy with the unmistakable enthusiasm. Offerings are piled at his feet, lettuce, pomegranates, even wooden phalluses carved with symbols of rebirth. One wall carving shows a festival parade where Min's statue is carried high, with his prominent feature leading the way like a compass of fertility. Children laugh. Women throw petals. Men pretend not to giggle. It's reverent, yes, but also undeniably cheeky. You'd think that would be scandalous. But ancient Egyptians didn't compartmentalize like we do. Fertility was sacred, not awkward. Life came from desire. And so festivals like these didn't shame pleasure, they elevated it. And then there's Bes. Ah, Bes, the dwarf god with lion's ears and a wild beard. Protector of households, childbirth, and interestingly, sexual pleasure. His face is stamped onto mirrors, beds, and amulets. Couples placed him under their mattresses to, well, ensure a good time. He's crude, comical, and deeply beloved. Where Hathor is beauty and elegance, Bes is belly laughs and noisy encouragement. Like your ancient wingman. At some festivals, actors dressed as Bes and performed body skits for crowds. Think ancient stand-up meets fertility theater. One famous image shows Bes playing the harp while his exaggerated manhood dangles like a metronome. That wasn't graffiti, it was a charm for laughter, lust, and luck. You slip into the back of a temple hall during the Feast of Opet, where the union of Ammonius and the goddess Mut is reenacted. The sacred bark rocks gently, symbolizing the divine lovemaking hidden behind temple veils. It's whispered that only the high priest and priestess enact the secret rite. Or maybe it's just statues in a ritual embrace. No one knows. That's the point. These rituals weren't meant to be fully understood. They were veiled, layered, symbolic, and steeped in magic. The union of gods was the union of Egypt itself, heaven and earth, male and female, Nile and desert. Sacred sex was just one more current in the river of cosmic balance. But not everyone celebrated so freely. You visit the house of a modest family outside Thebes. Here, the husband bows respectfully to a clay idol of Tauret, the hippo goddess of childbirth. No orgies. Just quiet prayers. For most Egyptians, sacred sex was something the gods did, the priests enacted, and the people observed from a safe, and sober, distance. And yet, even in daily life, little echoes remain. You find beds carved with fertility symbols, footboards shaped like lions to represent power and passion. You see household amulets depicting couples in mid-embrace. Not scandalous. Protective. Loving. Normal. It's a curious mix, the sacred and the playful. The solemn and the suggestive. And that, more than anything, seems to be Egypt's legacy. Finding holiness in heat, finding balance between reverence and reverie. You walk back into the courtyard. The music has softened. A girl lies on her back beneath the stars, laughing as her friend braids flowers into her hair. Somewhere, an old man plays a reed flute, its notes wandering like smoke into the night. You realize something. In Egypt, to honor the gods wasn't to deny pleasure, it was to elevate it. And in that dance, between flesh and spirit, they found their most powerful rituals. You wake to the snort of a hippo. Which sounds cute, until you remember hippos are responsible for more ancient Nile drownings than crocodiles or chariot crashes. And yet, bizarrely, that same deadly animal was once a favorite talisman for getting pregnant. Welcome to the strange world of Egyptian fertility hacks. You're standing in the corner of a bustling marketplace. The stalls are packed with incense bundles, onions strung like garlic charms, and carved figures of gods with unmistakable bulges or bulging eyes. Fertility isn't a private matter here, it's an open quest, a public concern, a community hope. And a booming industry. A woman with worn hands places a carved figure of Tauret, hippo-bodied, pregnant-bellied, lion-pawed, on a shrine in her home. She lights a cone of sweet-smelling resin and murmurs a prayer for healthy children. You glance closer, the statue's eyes are wide, its mouth in a protective snarl. In ancient Egypt, childbirth was a dangerous affair, and fertility was never taken for granted. Enter the charm brigade. Women wore amulets shaped like frogs, fish, even vulvas, symbols of fecundity. The frog, for instance, was sacred to Hecate, the goddess who breathed life into newborns. Her devotees believed that wearing a frog amulet might just tip the cosmic scale toward fertile. Some even tied beads over their bellies or wore hippo-shaped pendants under their clothes. Early, if slightly aggressive, versions of pregnancy bracelets. But charms alone weren't enough. You wander past a reed hut, where an elderly midwife grinds something between two stones. She's preparing a fertility potion, and you already regret sniffing it. Inside are dates, honey, herbs, and what might be powdered excrement. The line between medicine and magic is thin, and sometimes a little gross. One text from the Ebers Papyrus, a kind of ancient Egyptian medical textbook, recommends smearing specific oils and crocodile fat on the thighs to increase fertility. Another suggests ground carob pods mixed with beer, swallowed at dawn while facing east. Sounds scientific? Not remotely. But back then, anything that worked even once became gospel. Historians still argue whether these recipes were purely symbolic or if some ingredients had real hormonal effects. For example, dung palm dates, common in fertility brews, contain phytoestrogens. So maybe they were onto something, right between the dung and the divine. You pause at a small shrine by the Nile. A young couple has left offerings, a mirror, a lotus, and a fresh onion. Onions, it turns out, were fertility all-stars. They symbolized renewal, potency, and, let's be honest, they were everywhere. Temple priests tucked them under statues. Farmers ate them before bed. There's even evidence that women placed them in rather intimate locations to boost conception. We'll let your imagination handle that. Speaking of imagination, don't overlook the power of spoken spells. Egyptians believed that certain words carried creative energy, literally capable of birthing realities. A scribe might ink a love incantation onto papyrus, roll it into a bead, and sew it into your clothes. Or a midwife might chant over a woman's belly, invoking Hathor and Bes in alternating rhythms. You reach a narrow alley, where a young mother carries her baby in a sling. Around the baby's neck is a wooden charm, carved in the shape of a naked dwarf doing a joyful jig. Yep, it's Bes again. He's the god of laughter, dance, and virility. Having him nearby during pregnancy or childbirth was like having a divine doula who also told dirty jokes. And when all else failed, they called the priests. In one ritual, a clay model of a womb would be filled with honey and beer, then implanted into a hollow vessel. The priestess would perform chants while smoke from myrrh bathed the chamber. It was part science, part seance. The idea was to coax life into the womb, by sweetening it, literally. You begin to notice that fertility wasn't only a female matter. Men had roles, responsibilities, and rituals, too. They wore amulets shaped like erect phalluses, subtle, and bathed in lotus-infused oils. One text even recommends a man eat garlic, rub his legs with crocodile fat, and sleep facing north to encourage virility. You can almost hear the ancient equivalent of, "Bro, trust me. It works." And of course, the gods were always watching. Min, still standing proud in every fertility temple, received offerings of lettuce and sacred figs, both believed to enhance male potency. Couples seeking children would visit his statue, ask for his blessing, and sometimes engage in ritual acts nearby. Whether symbolic or literal, you suspect a fair amount of creative prayer happened in those courtyards. There's even evidence that some temples kept fertility dolls, figurines used during ceremonies to channel conception energy. Were they symbolic? Magical stand-ins? Or possibly early teaching tools for nervous couples? No one knows. But they were often worn smooth, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, like fertility heirlooms. Now, here's your quirky fringe fact. Some households kept geese specifically for fertility purposes. Not to eat, just to honk nearby as a kind of ambient egg-laying inspiration. Does it work? Not unless you're also an egg-laying species. But hey, ancient times called for creative solutions. You watch a priestess trace a circle in the sand around a young woman. She's ready to conceive, or hopes to. The ritual is gentle. A song. A touch of oil. A whispered prayer to the great goddess Hathor. There is no shame here. Only hope. And that's the real story. Beneath all the weird oils, charmed onions, and magical frogs, you find something deeply human. The longing to create. To nurture. To carry your name into eternity. You wander back toward the Nile as the sun dips behind the reeds. Children laugh in the distance. A boy tosses a lotus flower into the water, and it floats silently. So fragile. So full of promise. In ancient Egypt, to desire a child wasn't just natural, it was noble. And they were willing to try anything to make it happen. You open your eyes to a scent you wish you hadn't smelled. There's something thick in the air, sour, earthy, a little too alive. You glance around and realize where you are, the corner of a modest Egyptian home, where a young woman is preparing tonight's contraception. She's holding a small clay cone filled with, let's just say, you're about to learn far more about ancient birth control than you ever wanted to. Welcome to the world of ancient Egyptian family planning, a place where creativity flourished, modesty was optional, and the phrase, natural ingredients, went somewhere no wellness influencer should ever go. Let's start with the big one, crocodile dung. Yes. Really. Ancient Egyptian women sometimes inserted small, dried pats of crocodile excrement mixed with honey or natron, a naturally occurring salt, as a contraceptive barrier. The theory? The dung's texture could form a physical plug, while its alkaline properties might have also discouraged sperm motility. The result? Possibly effective. Definitely unpleasant. Historians still argue whether this was actually used by the majority of women, or whether it was more ritualistic, like a magical ward against pregnancy rather than a DIY diaphragm. Either way, your first reaction is probably the correct one. Wait, crocodile poop? There had to be other options. And there were. Papyrus scrolls from around 1850 BC offer surprisingly detailed recipes for preventing pregnancy. One includes ground acacia leaves mixed with dates and honey, applied intravaginally on a piece of lint. Strangely enough, modern science has found that acacia contains lactic acid, which does have spermicidal properties. That's right, 3,000 years before the pill, Egyptians may have stumbled upon a mild chemical contraceptive. Accident? Intuition? Trial and error with a lot of patience and a little discomfort? Probably all three. As you pass a marketplace, you hear women trading tips like modern aunties swapping TikTok hacks. One recommends wearing a charm inscribed with anti-fertility spells. Another swears by chewing dried sycamore bark during certain lunar phases. You smile. Some things never change, just the ingredients. And then there's honey. Oh, honey. Used in everything from embalming to skincare to, yes, birth control. Mixed with sour milk or natron, honey was inserted as a suppository to create a hostile environment for sperm. Whether this worked reliably is anyone's guess, but it probably didn't increase fertility, so that's something. Of course, not all methods were physical. Egyptians were deeply invested in magic-based contraception. You see a young scribe writing a spell to be worn around the waist, a thin strip of linen inked with protective words, tied tightly beneath the belly. A literal belt of abstinence by incantation. One preserved charm reads, I place a knot in the womb of insert name to hold fast what should not pass. You pause. That is remarkably poetic for what is essentially magical birth control. You might expect that such practices were secretive or shameful, but no. Sex was sacred, and managing reproduction was part of a balanced household. Fertility was a blessing, but so was spacing children or preserving a mother's health. Egyptian women weren't just passive vessels. They were proactive, curious, and often clever. You stop at a shrine to the goddess Nephthys, protector of childbirth and, some believed, contraception. Her worship included both prayers for fertility and protection against it. Two sides of the same divine coin. Now, here's a quirky little tale. One set of amulets discovered in the Fayum region features a small frog carved upside down. No one's sure why, but scholars guess it might have symbolized reversing fertility, turning it off like a switch. Is it effective? Absolutely not. Is it charming? Without a doubt. Not all Egyptian birth control was for women either. Some male methods existed, though much rarer. One odd recommendation in a medical text involves men bathing in cold water after sex to seal the seed. Another involves wearing a tightly bound sash soaked in cedar oil. Unclear if it worked. Clear that it was uncomfortable. Interestingly, there's very little evidence of abstinence being preached as the primary option. The Egyptians weren't prudes. They didn't fear sex, they respected it. Their goal wasn't to suppress desire, but to manage its outcomes. You enter a small home and notice something hanging above the bed, a carved image of Bes, again grinning wildly. But this time, he's depicted holding what looks like a rolled-up papyrus scroll near a woman's womb. It's believed this was a birth control spell, hidden as art. Bedroom decor with a very targeted purpose. Another fringe tidbit? Some Egyptian women may have used weasel testicles, dried and worn in small pouches, to avoid pregnancy. Likely borrowed from Babylonian practices, this method was based on sympathetic magic. This animal doesn't conceive often, so maybe it'll help me not conceive too. You're not sold on the science, but you respect the creativity. And what if none of it worked? Abortion wasn't widely recorded, but references do exist, often couched in euphemism. Certain potions were known as cleansing tonics, and some physical methods, like inserting sharp reeds, were whispered about in hushed circles. The risks were immense, and the tools crude. This was not a common route, but it wasn't entirely unknown either. You crouched beside a group of women weaving baskets and talking softly. One, older than the rest, shares a recipe involving pounded pomegranate rind and vinegar. She swears by it. Her daughter rolls her eyes. It didn't stop my brother. she jokes. Everyone laughs. And you laugh, too? Because in the end, contraception in ancient Egypt wasn't just science. It was community. Shared wisdom. Trial, error, and a whole lot of faith in frogs, onions, and divine intervention. As you walk home under the crescent moon, you imagine slipping into bed beside a partner. The linen sheets rustle, the oil lamp flickers, and hanging just above you is a small papyrus scroll tucked behind a carving of Hathor. No judgment. Just options. You wake up in the dim light of a flickering oil lamp, tucked inside what looks like a dusty old artist's workshop. Brushes stiff with dried pigment rest beside open jars of red ochre, black soot, and crushed malachite. But tonight's masterpiece isn't going to be another portrait of a pharaoh or a battle scene. It's something far more private. Someone's unrolling a long, folded sheet of papyrus. You squint. Nope, definitely not a battlefield. You've just stumbled onto the most famous X-rated scroll of the ancient world, the Turin erotic papyrus. It's ancient Egypt's hidden gem, and arguably its naughtiest piece of surviving art. Scholars still argue whether it's satire, sacred art, or just the world's oldest dirty joke. But whatever it is, it's graphic. You lean closer. The scenes unfold like an ancient comic strip, one that would absolutely be age-restricted on YouTube. Naked men with exaggerated features. Women in contorted poses, balancing wine jars or playing musical instruments while doing things that would put Cirque du Soleil to shame. No captions, no moral. Just page after page of unfiltered, unapologetic expression. One theory suggests the scroll was created for elite private amusement. Another claims it was satire, making fun of priestly hypocrisy or societal norms. Either way, someone put serious artistic effort into making this the ancient world's most risque coloring book. But that papyrus isn't a total anomaly. You walk through the ruins of Deir el-Medina, the workmen's village responsible for building the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. These artisans left behind cheeky wall graffiti, sketches on ostraca, broken pottery, and jokes carved beside their tools. Sex wasn't taboo here, it was just another part of life. One piece shows a woman bending forward, another a man chasing a goose with a very obvious agenda. You laugh before you can stop yourself. Sexual humor wasn't hidden. It was human. And the people here? They weren't saints. They were skilled laborers with callous hands, sore backs, and absolutely no filter after a long day carving someone else's afterlife. Let's talk about language. Egyptians had a whole set of euphemisms for the act of love, some sweet, some clever, and some downright hilarious. To know someone in the biblical sense? Sure. But also, to drink the lotus. Or, to come near like the Nile in flood. That one's a bit poetic, and also deeply seasonal. You can imagine an ancient pickup line. Hey girl, my river's about to rise. You pass a young man grinning as he recites a love poem to a friend, half for fun, half because he's hoping someone nearby is listening. One preserved verse says, I passed by her house, and my heart turned into a goose. My arms were useless. My breath stopped like still water. Dramatic? Yes. Sincere? Absolutely. And deeply sensual, in the way only a love-struck bricklayer can manage. Art wasn't limited to walls and scrolls. Household items, mirrors, combs, beds, were decorated with erotic carvings or symbolic poses. A wooden bed might feature a couple carved into the footboard, locked in eternal embrace. Not scandalous. Just normal. Even figurines took a saucy turn. You find one in a dusty corner shop, a clay woman grinding grain in a way that somehow manages to be both domestic and suggestive. Historians still debate if such figures were fertility charms, jokes, or practical teaching tools for new brides. Or maybe all three. Let's not forget the Kahan gynecological papyrus, which includes a list of diagnoses and treatments for women's reproductive health. Some of it is surprisingly clinical, and some, not so much. One line mentions determining pregnancy by placing garlic in a woman's, well, let's say internal regions and then checking her breath the next morning. If you smell garlic? Pregnant? If not, keep trying. Science? No. Innovative? You bet. You come across a wooden board used for gaming, Senate, a popular pastime. But this one's different. A few of the squares are etched with symbols that look suspiciously like the erotic positions from the Turin papyrus. A custom-made adult edition? That, or someone really misunderstood the rules. Egyptians weren't shy about positions either. One papyrus lists a variety of them, and a wall painting in a noblewoman's private bath area shows two lovers intertwined in a pose that would earn a mature rating on any streaming service. And yet, the art is elegant. Sensual, not crude. A reminder, to Egyptians, the erotic was a form of beauty, not shame. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some scholars believe certain love spells came with illustrated manuals. Tiny scrolls with stick-figure demonstrations of how to win a lover or please a spouse. Whether real or mythical, you can't help but picture an ancient scribe saying, "Let me draw you a diagram." Sexuality wasn't always fun in games. In some contexts, it was used to shame or ridicule. One carving shows a man bent over with his tunic lifted, a punishment, a joke, or maybe just really specific graffiti. Egyptians weren't above roasting each other in the bedroom department. Still, the bulk of erotic art and text feels celebratory. Joyful. Human. Sex wasn't evil. It wasn't hidden. It was part of being whole. You could worship Hathor at sunrise and draw bawdy cartoons by lunch, no contradiction. As the lamp flickers and shadows shift, you're left with the realization that ancient Egyptians had a better grasp on sensual balance than many societies today. They weren't prudish nor obsessed. They simply made room for love, lust, laughter, and the occasional goose-chasing cartoon, without apology. You lie back on the cool stone floor, and in your mind's eye, the erotic scrolls unfurl once more, grinning, unabashed, and very much alive. You awake on silk sheets you definitely didn't fall asleep on. There's gold trim at the corners, perfume in the air, and servants tiptoeing past the door. You're not in a mud-brick home anymore. You're in the palace now, where love is complicated, sex is strategic, and hair is a clue that someone's about to get betrayed. Welcome to the royal bedrooms of ancient Egypt. Here, marriages aren't about romance. They're about alliances, inheritance, and keeping power in the family. Literally. You shuffle quietly down a painted hallway, where scenes of courtship look suspiciously like paperwork. That's because for royals, love was secondary. The pharaoh had a divine duty to maintain cosmic order, and that meant producing heirs. Preferably many. Preferably male. Preferably from someone within the royal bloodline. So yeah, things got a little incestuous. You peek into a chamber where the queen sits brushing her wig, because no one just lets their natural hair hang out in the palace. Clean-shaven heads were the standard, both for hygiene and aesthetics. A royal's hair, or the lack of it, said everything. Loose hair? Intimate moment. Elaborate wig? Public appearance. Entirely bald? Maybe it's bath day, or maybe someone's in mourning. But back to that queen. She's probably also a sister. Or half-sister. Or cousin-wife of the king. The lines blur faster than a Nile flood. This wasn't just accepted, it was expected. The logic was simple. The pharaoh was divine. His blood was sacred. So to preserve it, he had to marry someone who shared it. That's how you get love triangles shaped more like Mobius strips. Take Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Possibly siblings, possibly cousins, definitely complicated. Their intimacy is immortalized in loving frescoes, holding hands, kissing, sharing affection in ways most royal couples never displayed publicly. Historians still debate whether Nefertiti ruled as pharaoh in her own right, or if she morphed into the mysterious Smenkhare. Either way, theirs was a partnership of both power and, apparently, genuine affection. Then there's Cleopatra, the queen who famously did not invent eyeliner but did marry both her brothers. As tradition dictated. She later partnered with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but those relationships were likely more political than passionate, although the Roman poets would have you believe otherwise. Back to palace life. You notice something odd. There's a lot of attention paid to scent. Perfume cones melt slowly atop wigs, releasing fragrant oils during ceremonies. Bedrooms are scented with myrrh and kifi, a resinous incense blend. Why? Because smelling good wasn't just sexy, it was divine. Gods smelled fragrant. A foul odor meant impurity. So if you wanted to attract a royal lover, or the favor of Hathor, you better smell like heaven itself. You pass a room with guards standing outside. Inside is a royal concubine. She's not just a mistress, she might be the mother of a future pharaoh. Concubines had ambiguous power. Some were foreign princesses sent as diplomatic gifts, others born of noble Egyptian houses. If they bore a male child, they could suddenly become very important. If not? Forgotten footnote. Jealousy, you ask? Oh, absolutely. Royal harems weren't passive beauty pageants. They were hotbeds of rivalry, suspicion, and the occasional full-blown conspiracy. Remember Ramses III? His harem plotted to assassinate him so one of the secondary wives could elevate her son to the throne. That plot failed, but not before making it into the history books and court transcripts, which, by the way, still survive. And speaking of rivals, shaved heads could signal more than just fashion. A concubine caught scheming might be publicly shaved as punishment, symbolic, humiliating, and politically loaded. Hair was beauty, identity, even intimacy. To lose it was to be stripped of favor. You sit beside a carved vanity where a queen once applied her makeup. Kohl for the eyes, red ochre for the lips. Not just to look good, but as protection. Eye makeup was believed to ward off disease and curses. So when she looked into the mirror, she wasn't just admiring herself, she was safeguarding her soul. But despite the intrigue, love did exist in the palace. Hidden in letters and offerings, in the way one name was carved slightly closer to another's on a temple wall. One famous love letter, penned by a noblewoman to her royal husband, reads, "Come to me quickly, and do not delay. I wait for you like the grain waits for the flood." Not exactly subtle. But sincere? Entirely. Let's not ignore the darker side of royal passion. Sex scandals weren't unknown. Pharaohs accused of sleeping with their daughters. Queens rumored to take lovers from the guards. Most of it is buried under centuries of political spin, but every so often, a record slips through, a line on a papyrus, a scribbled note in court documents. True or slander? Historians still argue. One quirky fact: some royal birth rituals involved symbolic acts with carved phalluses, placed beneath the royal bed to encourage conception. These weren't sex toys. They were sacred talismans, imbued with protective spells. Of course, someone had to clean them. You imagine that job didn't make it into the tomb inscriptions. You walk through a royal bedroom and notice the bed is slightly elevated, with lion-shaped legs and a wooden headrest, not a pillow in sight. That's because pillows were seen as soft, luxurious, maybe even decadent. For a proper pharaoh, a hard headrest kept the spirit aligned with the stars. You wonder how anyone managed romance in that setup. Then again, when you're divine, maybe you don't need lumbar support. In a far corner of the palace, a forgotten corridor holds paintings of royal couples entwined, intimate moments rarely meant for public eyes. A brushstroke here, a gaze there. It's clear, even in all the politics and power plays, there were stolen moments. Laughter. Longing. Maybe even love. You sit by the window, watching the sun set over the Nile. Somewhere behind those thick curtains, a queen is slipping off her wig, a king is reading a fertility spell, and a scribe is trying to remember how to spell eternal devotion without smudging the ink. In the palace, nothing is simple. But everything, love, lust, loyalty, is layered with meaning. You awaken to the rhythmic tapping of a reed pen on papyrus. The air smells of ink and candle smoke. You're in a scribal school, tucked behind a quiet temple, where boys learn how to write spells, keep accounts, and, when the teacher isn't looking, draw surprisingly detailed pictures of body parts. It's time to discover how the ancient Egyptians taught their children about sex, reproduction, and the mysteries of life. Spoiler alert, It didn't come with a glossy pamphlet or a cartoon owl. In ancient Egypt, sex education wasn't a formal class. There were no diagrams handed out, no birds and bees lectures from blushing parents. Instead, information came from three places: observation, magic, and stories, often with animal metaphors or riddles you'd probably fail to decode on your first try. You glance over a student's shoulder. He's copying a passage from the Instruction of Ani, one of many wisdom texts passed from father to son. It talks about behavior, humility, marriage, and the importance of not chasing every woman with a garment. Subtle, right? Another line advises him to choose a wife who is clean in her house, which might sound like a hygiene tip, but probably has double meaning. The goal wasn't to spell things out, but to embed sexual morality and wisdom into broader life lessons. Parents likely filled in the gaps, sometimes literally. One mother might say, "The goddess hath given you 2 arms and 1 eye, use them wisely," which either means, "Be careful with your responsibilities," or "Stop touching yourself." Ancient parenting was full of layers. One quirky fringe tidbit? There's a spell in the magical papyri meant to open a man's eyes to the nature of women. No, not metaphorically. The spell includes a potion and a chant, and if it worked, he'd suddenly understand how women think. Scholars still argue whether this was mystical sex ed or just the ancient version of a teenage boy Googling, "What does she mean when she says she's fine?" As for girls, their education was more home-based. Mothers, aunts, and midwives passed down the practical knowledge: childbirth, body changes, herbal remedies, what to wear to a festival if you want someone to notice your perfume. Women were the guardians of reproductive wisdom, from how to charm a man to how not to have his baby until you were ready. You find a wall painting of a young couple at a feast. The girl is offering a lotus flower, a known symbol of sexuality and rebirth. The boy reaches for it, just barely. It's a subtle moment, and likely meant to convey consent, invitation, and growing curiosity. Teenagers then weren't so different from teenagers now, blushing, awkward, and trying very hard to play it cool. Graffiti left by students offers more direct clues. One reads, "Pornhub loves to peep through windows." Another scribble simply says, "The baker's daughter smiles at everyone, but follows no one." Whether these were jokes, warnings, or reputation-shaping gossip, they reflect a world where sexuality was acknowledged early, even if discussed in coded ways. You sit in a classroom and listen to the boys recite multiplication tables. Then, during break, they whisper about the scribe's daughter, how she wore a red sash today, how that means she might be seeking Hathor's blessing. Is it true? Probably not. But the belief that colors, accessories, and subtle signs conveyed sexual openness was common. Body language was its own kind of lesson. Temple schools also played a part. Though rare for most, some elite children, especially boys destined for priesthood, would learn hymns and mythic stories rich with symbolic sexuality. The myth of Isis and Osiris, with its magical conception via a golden phallus, was both a religious story and a quiet tutorial on reproduction, loss, and love. And let's not forget the statues. In homes, children would see images of Tauret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, and Bes, the dwarf god who grinned from under many a family bed. Children may not have understood everything, but they learned early that life came from love, from union, from the goddess' blessing, and probably also from that strange ritual Aunt Tia performed with the pomegranate and the chanting. You walk into a modest house and find a painted pot in the corner. On its surface, 2 animals, perhaps donkeys or jackals, are in what is definitely not a wrestling match. Was it meant to educate? Amuse? Or simply decorate? Whatever the case, it's a reminder that children learn from what they saw, not just what they were told. And what about abstinence? It existed, mostly for priests before rituals, or for fasting periods. But there's little evidence that celibacy was taught as a life virtue. Egyptians believed in moderation, not denial. Lust was natural, but control was wise. One text advises young men not to leap like a goat among the fields of others. Solid advice, though not great if you're into goats. You pass a girl being taught how to grind herbs. Her mother explains which ones soothe cramps, which ones increase fertility, and which ones keep the seed from taking root. She doesn't call it birth control, but that's exactly what it is. Hands-on, woman-to-woman education. Quiet. Practical. Ancient. And just when you think it's all subtlety and symbolism, you stumble upon a papyrus fragment that's basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a puberty pamphlet. It lists body changes, moon cycles, and proper bath techniques. One line reads, "Do not fear the bleeding of the young woman, it is the goddess cleansing her path." That's about as comforting as a mystical metaphor gets. The sun sets over the school courtyard. The students gather to recite hymns, some to Thoth, some to Hathor, the goddess of love. They giggle, stumble on the words, and pretend they don't know what half of them mean. But they do. Or they will. Because in Egypt, sex education wasn't a talk, it was a lifelong exposure. Laced into myth, etched into walls, passed down in whispers and winks. You didn't get told, you learned by living. You awakened to silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the watchful kind, the sort of hush that follows you into sacred spaces. You're inside a temple now, deep in its inner sanctum. The walls shimmer faintly in torchlight, and somewhere beyond the pillars, a priest chants in a language old enough to wrinkle the stone. Tonight you're not just walking among gods, you're walking between genders. In the modern world, we often box people into binary categories. Male. Female. That's it. But here, in ancient Egypt, things are less rigid and more fluid, especially when it comes to divine identity. So get ready to rethink everything you thought you knew about gender in the ancient world. You begin with Adam, the creator god we met way back in section 1. He creates the world by, quite literally, generating life from himself. Alone. Self-sufficient. In some texts, Adam is described as both male and female. Complete. Whole. The ultimate non-binary being. Then there's Happy, god of the Nile floods. Despite being referred to with masculine pronouns, Happy is portrayed with a full chest and rounded belly, symbols of nourishment and fertility. You look up at a painted relief of him now, blue-skinned, water pouring from jars in each hand, and for a moment you realize this isn't just a he. It's a divine nurturer. A provider. Gender here is function, not form. One fringe theory suggests that priests may have used these divine androgynies to explain intersex births, seen not as errors, but as sacred echoes of divine wholeness. Scholars still argue whether this was truly tolerant understanding or poetic rationalization. Either way, it's more nuanced than you expected. You step into a shrine to Mut, wife of Ammonius, whose name means mother. Yet in some depictions she wears a double crown, symbol of both Upper and Lower Egypt, and carries a Lianis's power, sometimes even merging with the warlike goddess Sekhmet. Mother and destroyer. Nurturer and hunter. Woman, yes, but far from gentle. Then there's Sekhtor, a little-known deity mentioned in a few late-period texts, whose form and attributes shift between male and female depending on ritual context. And of course, the serpent goddess Wadjet, who sometimes becomes a cobra with masculine energy when protecting pharaohs in battle. Gender was adaptable, transformable, almost like magic. You glance at the priests around you. Some shave their entire bodies, wear linen robes indistinguishable from those of temple maidens, and take vows that remove them from traditional gender roles. Not celibacy, necessarily, but ritual detachment. The body is a tool. Identity is negotiable. Then you come across something even more curious, the Khnumhotep and Nyankhnum tomb. Remember them from earlier? These two men, buried side by side, are depicted in poses usually reserved for married couples. Their names are merged, their hands clasped, noses touching. Was it brotherhood? Partnership? Love? We'll never know. But someone carved their story in stone for eternity, and that says something. Egyptian society, for all its rules, left space for ambiguity. Men could be nurturing. Women could be authoritative. There were female pharaohs, Hatshepsut, of course, who famously donned the false beard and male regalia to rule without question. The beard wasn't about deception. It was about language. Visual vocabulary. "Look," it said. "I am king. Not queen. King. Full stop. You sit beside a statue of her now. The inscription refers to her as His Majesty. Her body remains female. Her power? Fully masculine. Yet the people followed her, honored her, buried her in the Valley of the Kings. History tried to erase her, literally chipping her name from the walls. But her legacy lingers. Back in the village, you observe how gender played out in daily life. Men baked. Women sold linen. Boys learned to dance. Girls worked as scribes. Roles were flexible, especially in the lower classes where practicality mattered more than rigid labels. A family needed survival, not stereotypes. If your daughter was good at counting grain, you let her manage it. If your son sang lullabies better than his sister, well, you let him rock the baby. But identity wasn't just about doing. It was about being. One mid-tier priest you pass wears eye paint, delicate jewelry, and speaks in soft tones. Is he effeminate? Is she transitioning? Is that even a question people here ask? No one seems confused. Everyone seems fine. You wander into a craftsman's home, where small clay figures sit along the windowsill. Some are obviously male or female. Others are androgynous, rounded torsos, blank faces, double symbols carved at their base. These aren't mistakes. They're deliberate. Maybe they were household spirits. Maybe fertility tokens for families who didn't fit the mold. And then there's the symbolism. Ankh for life. Was for power. And the Jed, a pillar symbolizing stability, which scholars think might also represent a spine or even a stylized phallus. But here's the twist. It's often paired with the Chet, a symbol resembling a looped sash, traditionally interpreted as feminine. When these two appear together, male and female symbols side by side, they don't conflict. They complete. You think back to the stories. Adam as both parents. Happy as both nourisher and force. Isis and Osiris, whose union births a kingdom. Nut and Geb, lovers forever reaching for one another. Egyptian mythology never pretended simplicity. Instead, it celebrated tension, contrast, transformation. And you realize, to them, fluidity wasn't a flaw, it was a divine trait. As the night deepens, the temple quiets again. You sit under a painted ceiling filled with stars, and for a moment you feel it, the gentle unmooring of identity from expectation. The freedom to be one thing. Or both things. Or many things, all at once. In ancient Egypt, gender wasn't a box. It was a constellation. You wake to shouting. Not joyful festival shouting, angry shouting. Something's gone wrong. A pot's been smashed. A man storms out of a house, tunic askew, face redder than a sun-baked brick. Behind him, a woman curses him in a tone that could peel paint off a pyramid. Welcome to the not-so-rosy side of love in ancient Egypt, when sex, desire, or betrayal crossed the line. You slip into a nearby alley and peer around the corner. Neighbors pretend to mind their own business, but they're listening, too. Adultery in ancient Egypt wasn't just juicy gossip, it could be a life-altering scandal. The rules were clear, marriage was sacred, and stepping outside that bond came with consequences, not always physical, but always social. The legal system, surprisingly advanced for its time, had mechanisms to handle sexual misconduct. In more severe cases, a woman caught cheating could be publicly humiliated, banished, or even divorced without compensation. A man? He might face a fine, a beating, or be forced to forfeit property. But surprise, consequences often hit harder for women. Still, it wasn't all doom. In the village of Deir el-Medina, we find court records of real people bringing cases of sexual insult, inappropriate advances, or outright affairs to local councils. One man accused his neighbor of sleeping with his wife while he was away at work. His neighbor replied, essentially, "Prove it." Ancient legal drama at its finest. But not all consequences came from judges. Some came from the gods. You enter a small shrine where a woman kneels, weeping into a bowl of water. She believes her husband has been unfaithful. But rather than go to court, she's gone to magic. A priestess chants beside her, stirring the water with a reed, calling on Hathor to reveal the truth, or deliver justice. This is the world of ritual cleansing, curses, and divine retribution. Egyptians believed that immoral sex, especially betrayal or coercion, could pollute a person's ka, their life force. So even if society didn't catch you, the gods might. And they had creative ways of expressing disappointment. There's a curious spell in the Cairo magical papyrus designed to curse a cheating lover. It involves burning the name of the unfaithful person, mixing the ash with urine, and smearing it on their doorstep. Does it work? Probably not. But imagine walking home and finding that on your mat. One fringe case recorded in court documents tells of a woman who tried to place a spell on her ex to render him impotent, so that he may stand tall no more. As the text delicately puts it. Whether it worked is unclear, but his next girlfriend filed a complaint very shortly afterward. Even within the spiritual realm, crossing sexual lines had risks. In temples, purity was key. Priests and priestesses often had to abstain before performing rituals, not because sex was dirty, but because it was powerful. Mishandling that power, whether through an affair, coercion, or inappropriate contact, could taint an entire ceremony. You step into a bathhouse where whispers circulate like steam. A woman's been cast out from the temple kitchen, not for theft, but for sleeping with the wrong acolyte. The oil jars curdled after that. Someone mutters. Coincidence? Maybe. But in Egypt, bad luck and bad behavior often went hand in hand. Sometimes, punishment wasn't public, it was posthumous. You find a tomb where the names on the walls have been scratched out. A pharaoh's concubine who crossed the queen. Gone. Erased. In Egypt, this was the ultimate penalty. Without your name, you couldn't exist in the afterlife. You couldn't breathe. You couldn't eat. You were dust. A cold, quiet form of justice. Still, not every transgression ended in doom. Some couples simply separated. Divorce was legal, common, and, by some accounts, fairly straightforward. You packed up your beads, took your donkey, and left. Contracts ensured property division. Children stayed with the mother usually. No need for courtroom drama. Just goodbye. But there were emotional consequences, too. Love spells weren't just for attraction, they were also for revenge. A scorned lover might call on Isis to bring sleepless nights, or on Bes to keep their ex's bedroom cold and lonely. One spell reads, "May his heart burn like resin upon the coals, until he comes crawling." Subtle? Not remotely. Effective? Hard to say. Let's not pretend ancient Egypt was paradise. Sexual misconduct did happen. Assault, unfortunately, was not unknown. Some records mention men who take without asking, and the legal repercussions vary depending on class. Elite women had more protection. Servants often had none. But even here, ritual and religion stepped in. A woman who'd been violated might visit a priestess for cleansing, recite hymns to reclaim her purity, or carry protective charms made from carnelian. The scars were real, but the effort to heal, spiritually at least, was too. One fringe practice? The use of truth water, a potion given to suspected cheaters, supposedly forcing confession by inducing vomiting if they lied. It's more likely this was psychosomatic, or simply very bad wine with side effects. Still, the fear of exposure kept some people honest, or at least creative, in their excuses. You step into a public square where a storyteller is reciting a cautionary tale, a nobleman who kept 2 wives and 3 lovers, only to die mysteriously and be reincarnated as a donkey with no tail. Children laugh. Adults nod. Morality tale delivered. At the end of the day, Egyptians didn't expect perfection. They expected balance. If you strayed, you made amends. If you broke a bond, you honored the pain. And if you got caught with someone else's wife? Well, best hope you had an afterlife plan. As the shouting from earlier fades into awkward silence, You watch the man return to the house, head bowed, voice low. The door opens. He enters. No one yells this time. Maybe there's forgiveness. Maybe just negotiation. But in Egypt, even broken trust could sometimes be patched. With magic, with prayer, or just with time. You wake up in a swirl of smoke and whispers. Someone nearby is grinding powder in a small dish. Another is heating oil over a flame. A third hums softly, mixing herbs into wine. Welcome to the most potent corner of ancient Egyptian life, the marketplace of love spells, lust potions, and magical mischief. You're in a street stall at the edge of Thebes, where behind the linen curtains and baskets of figs, an older woman named Tia is brewing enchantments. Her sign doesn't say which, but locals know. Need someone to fall in love with you? Tia. Want to make your ex lose sleep for a week? Tia. Looking to feel very confident at tonight's festival? Say no more. She hands you a jar, amber liquid with a sweet, earthy smell. Poppy, date wine, and a touch of mandrake, she says. You hesitate. She grins. Don't drink too much unless you want to mistake your goat for your husband. Ancient Egyptian flirt magic was nothing if not unpredictable. But this wasn't superstition, it was standard practice. Egyptians believed desire could be stirred, blocked, twisted, or healed through spells. You recite the words, wear the charm, sip the tonic, and fate leans in your direction. One popular love spell involves writing a person's name on a piece of papyrus, anointing it with oils, and burning it while chanting. As this flame consumes, so shall his heart be kindled for me. Historians still debate whether these spells were actually common or reserved for the desperate or elite. But the instructions are real, preserved in scrolls like the Greek-Egyptian magical papyri. That's where things get spicy. One scroll lists a potion to be rubbed upon the loins before approaching your beloved. Ingredients? Wine, honey, saffron, and a dash of menstrual blood. Ancient Egyptians had few taboos about bodily fluids. In fact, blood, especially from women, was seen as magically powerful. Dangerous if mishandled, potent when controlled. And it wasn't just the ingredients, it was timing. Spells worked best under specific lunar phases, star alignments, or while whispering certain names. Some even had to be sung, yes, sung, in soft, rhythmic tones that echoed the gods' language. Imagine seducing your crush with a lullaby and a shot of gingered wine. That was Tuesday for some people here. You step into a quieter stall. Here small amulets hang on strings, scarabs for attraction, hathor-shaped pendants for confidence, and a few best dolls grinning like they've seen everything. One woman buys a stone carved with entwined snakes, the symbol of eternal entanglement. He'll never stray again, she says with a wink. You hope he doesn't like snakes. Of course, not all spells were about summoning love. Many were for repelling it. Women sometimes wore charms to deflect unwanted advances or slow a suitor's passion. One protective spell, written in tight, red ink says, "May his limbs falter, his fire cool, and his eyes seek elsewhere." Honestly, feels like something you'd put on a tote bag today. Another popular trick? Carrying mandrake root, known for its human-like shape and intoxicating scent. Used in tiny doses, it heightened arousal. Used in larger doses, well, you'd be too dizzy to do much of anything. Egyptians loved walking that fine line. You crouched beside a young man consulting with a temple scribe. He's in love, hopelessly. The girl doesn't return his glances. He wants her to dream of him every night. The scribe, without missing a beat, prescribes a dream intrusion spell: burn incense beside her home, chant her name, and place your image under her threshold. Harmless? Maybe. Slightly creepy? Depends on your level of magical ethics. Some spells went even further, into the realm of domination. One text, folded into a tiny leather pouch, reads, "May she hunger for me like the dead hunger for the offering. May her body remember me when she drinks, eats, and sleeps." That's intense. But remember, ancient Egyptians didn't see magic as evil. They saw it as influence. A tool. A way to tilt destiny slightly in your favor. Dangerous if abused, but powerful when used with care. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. A spell survives that promises to help someone find a lover, shaped like a specific god. As in, bring me a man with the shoulders of Horus, the eyes of Ra, and the loins of Ammonius. A little bold. A lot specific. We call that manifesting now. You notice gender flexibility in these spells too. Some are clearly written by men for women, others by women for women, or men for men. The formulas adapt. The gods invoke change. There's room for every kind of desire, every kind of longing. As long as you've got the right herbs. Not all love magic was about seduction. Some was about repair. A woman might burn blue lotus petals to rekindle passion with her husband. A husband might wear a copper ring etched with both their names to bind their hearts together in the afterlife. Love didn't stop at death. It just got metaphysical. And when magic failed, well, there were always aphrodisiacs. You find a recipe scratched on a wall near a bathhouse. 3-pound figs, 5 carob pods, 1 pinch of myrrh. Mix with date wine. Drink before sunset. Wait. Wait for what? Love? Lust? A stomach ache? All possible. Some combinations probably did heighten desire. Others may have just tasted really nice. Or helped you forget your loneliness for an evening. As twilight falls, the spell stalls begin to close. Incense fades. Bottles are sealed. Tia hands you one last item, a small bundle wrapped in linen. For dreams, she says, and nods toward the moon. You don't know what's inside. Maybe nothing. Maybe hope. But in Egypt, hope itself was a kind of magic, and love was its most potent spell. You wake to the scent of resin and a whisper that doesn't quite feel human. Stone walls rise around you, cool, still, eternal. You're in a tomb, but it doesn't feel dead. It feels paused. As if the people inside are only sleeping, waiting for something. And if you're wondering whether the ancient Egyptians thought sex ended with death, oh no. Strap in. The afterlife just got awkwardly sensual. You drift past painted reliefs, husband and wife sitting together, clasping hands, sharing wine, smiling at each other in poses eerily intimate. You're not looking at memories. These are forecasts. Visions of what the couple plans to keep doing long after they're 6 feet under and thoroughly wrapped in linen. Because yes, love, marriage, and yes, sex were all expected to continue in the afterlife. Take the Book of the Dead, Egypt's spiritual travel guide for the recently deceased. It's full of spells to help you breathe, eat, walk, and yes, perform acts of pleasure. In the Field of Reeds, their version of paradise. There's even a spell to restore your manhood after death. Let's just say, arise, takes on a very literal meaning here. One such passage calls on Osiris to bless the deceased with the strength of a bull and the joy of the flesh. Historians still debate whether this was symbolic or a very optimistic expectation for the post-mortem experience. But either way, the desire for pleasure didn't stop at embalming. And speaking of embalming, brace yourself. You pass by a workshop where a body is being prepared. The embalmers are precise, reverent, but behind their solemnity hides a disturbing footnote from ancient legal scrolls. A few embalmers were accused of necrophilia. Yeah. Even Egypt had those guys. To prevent this, families began waiting a few extra days before turning over the deceased young women to the embalmers. A chilling reminder that when sex meets power imbalance, even the sacred can be profaned. But let's steer the ship back to safer waters. The afterlife wasn't just about physical pleasure. It was about relationship continuity. Husbands and wives were buried together, side by side, so they could reunite. Some tombs depict the couple embracing, surrounded by symbols of rebirth, lotus flowers, ankhs, and the rising sun. One quirky little find? A pair of funerary figurines discovered holding hands, and according to some archaeologists, spooning. It's not official doctrine, but it is incredibly cute. You enter a chamber filled with ushabti, little servant statues placed in tombs to work on your behalf in the afterlife. Some are carved with flirtatious smiles, others with exaggerated anatomy. Was that just wishful thinking? Or were they meant to be helpful? Then there's the case of the erotic coffin panel, a decorative piece found in a nobleman's burial showing him surrounded by 3 female figures, all quite underdressed, with text promising pleasures unending. No one's really sure whether this was a fantasy, a spiritual belief, or just a cheeky last wish. Scholars call it fringe. We call it hopeful. You settle beside a sarcophagus, its lid carved with protective texts. Among them, spells for reanimation, healing, and strength in the loins. A man's vitality wasn't measured just by strength or conquest, but by his ability to enjoy his wife and father children, even beyond the grave. And for women? Tomb inscriptions often refer to them as mistress of the house, beloved of her husband, beautiful of body. These weren't just compliments. They were eternal titles, designed to shape her identity in the afterlife, where she would still be admired, desired, and cherished. Love spells weren't buried with the body, but the memory of love was. Some coffins bear poetry. My heart is joined with yours, as the Nile joins with its canals. May we drink, dance, and lie together in the halls of Osiris forever. You sigh. Maybe ancient Egyptians were the original hopeless romantics, with access to embalming fluid. But beyond the flowers and figurines, there's a deeper truth. Sex, for them, wasn't separate from the soul. It was part of the soul's journey. A life well lived was one of joy, intimacy, laughter, and those things didn't just vanish when your heart was weighed by Anubis. Even mummies get love stories. One fringe legend speaks of a mummy buried with a carved wooden statue resembling his wife. Not because she had died, but because he couldn't bear the thought of waking up alone. The statue wore a ring made from hair, wrapped in linen, placed near his heart. Whether the story is true or just poetic rumor, it tells you something essential about this culture. They didn't fear death as a full stop. They saw it as a bedroom door, closed gently behind you, with someone waiting on the other side. As you leave the tomb, dawn breaks over the desert. You feel oddly comforted. Somewhere in the afterlife's endless fields, a couple is walking hand in hand, lotus blossoms in their path, wine in their hands, warmth in their hearts. And probably, if the spells worked, a very romantic night ahead. You wake up surrounded by lies. Well, not lies exactly, misunderstandings, mistranslations, movies, internet memes. That random guy on TikTok who swears Cleopatra bathed in goat milk and invented eyeliner. You're standing in a museum gift shop now, flipping through glossy coffee table books and souvenir scrolls. Welcome to the part of our journey where we sort myth from truth. Because if you've heard something spicy about ancient Egyptian sex culture, odds are it's been Hollywoodified, memeified, or stretched beyond recognition. Let's clear things up, gently. First myth, Cleopatra and the Golden Orgy Yacht. Sorry to disappoint, but there is no solid evidence that Cleopatra held lavish sex parties while floating down the Nile, tossing grapes into the mouths of poets. Most of her wildest stories, milk baths, seduction scrolls, that infamous carpet entrance, come from Roman sources, especially Plutarch and Cassius Dio, who had political reasons to paint her as a manipulative seductress. In truth, Cleopatra was brilliant, multilingual, politically strategic, and yes, probably charismatic. But an orgy queen? Historians still argue. More likely, she used romance with Caesar and Antony as power tools, not pleasure cruises. Second myth, erotic pyramid carvings. Nope. The pyramids are not covered in explicit imagery. They're tombs, not bachelor pads. The so-called pornographic hieroglyphs are often misread. That picture of a man and a baboon? Probably symbolic. That image with 2 figures embracing? Likely religious. That doodle in a workman's hut of a woman and a flute? Okay, that one's real, but it's from Deir el-Medina, not Giza. You glance at a t-shirt that reads, Ancient Egyptians invented sex. Not quite. They celebrated it, recorded it, even drew instructional scrolls. But sex, contrary to souvenir logic, is not an Egyptian invention. They were just unusually relaxed about it. Here's a fun misconception: mummies were buried with Viagra-like herbs to help them perform in the afterlife. There are herbs buried with mummies, yes, like myrrh, frankincense, and occasionally mandrake, but their purpose was more spiritual than sensual. Although, if eternal virility was a side effect, no one complained. Let's talk about the term erotic papyrus again. You remember, the spicy scroll from section 7. Sometimes it's claimed to be mainstream ancient pornography. In reality, it's one of a kind. Scholars still argue whether it's satire, parody, or private art. But no, this wasn't hanging in Grandma's house. It's the exception, not the norm. Another myth: all Egyptians had wild temple sex. As fun as that sounds, most people weren't reenacting godly unions between incense sticks. Ritual sex likely occurred in highly controlled ceremonial settings involving priests, priestesses, or symbolic statues, not a weekly public orgy. Also false: the pharaoh had hundreds of wives and slept with all of them. While some pharaohs had royal harems and multiple wives, the numbers are often exaggerated. More importantly, many of those women were symbolic partners, political alliances, or even high priestesses, not active romantic partners. You pause at a replica statue of Min, the ever-proud fertility god with, his very visible credentials. Yes, he really looked like that. And yes, Egyptians worshipped him seriously. But no, people weren't walking around treating that as casual decor. His image was powerful, not pornographic. To them, his exuberance meant life, rebirth, strength. Let's revisit another misunderstood favorite. Hatshepsut wore a fake beard, so she must have been trans. Interesting theory, but not quite. She wore the beard because that's what pharaohs did. It was visual code, not a declaration of gender identity. Egyptians used gender symbols fluidly in art and language, but not always in ways that map neatly onto modern identities. Here's a fun fringe myth: Egyptians used fish bladder condoms. That one's Greek, actually. The Egyptians used other methods, like honey pastes and linen plugs, but fish? Unlikely. However, they did use croc dung. So, trade-offs. You flip through a kid's history book. One chapter claims Egyptians feared sex before marriage. That's a stretch. Marriage wasn't even always formal. Cohabitation was often enough. Sexual relations weren't forbidden outside marriage, but infidelity and dishonesty? That's where things got dicey. You also hear people say, Egypt was sexually liberated. True, but not in a modern, free love kind of way. It wasn't about doing whatever with whomever. It was about balance, ma'at, harmony. Sex had meaning, symbolism, and consequences. They didn't shame the body, but they also didn't trivialize it. Now, here's one modern misconception worth rethinking: ancient people were less romantic. False. Some of the most tender, poetic love letters ever found came from ancient Egypt. I wish I were her laundryman, so I might wash the garment that touches her body. Swoon. You don't need Netflix to know romance. So why all the myths? Because Egypt was mysterious, exotic, and ancient. Later cultures, Greeks, Romans, Victorians, Hollywood, projected their own fantasies onto it. They saw statues and scrolls and filled in the blanks with whatever titillated them. And let's be honest, Cleopatra, the strategically astute diplomat, doesn't sell as many movie tickets as Cleopatra, the silk-wrapped seductress of the sands. But now you know better. The real Egypt was rich, nuanced, earthy, sensual, sacred, and sometimes silly. They celebrated love without shame, desire without destruction, and bodies as both mortal and divine. They didn't need myths to make their culture fascinating. They already lived the truth, and it was way more interesting. You wake beneath a linen canopy fluttering in the breeze. The air is soft, full of morning birdsong and the faint scent of desert myrrh. Your time in ancient Egypt is coming to a close. But before you drift fully back to your own century, there's one last thread to follow: the way echoes of all you've seen and learned still linger from the Nile to now. You rise and walk the narrow streets of a modern Egyptian village, The architecture is different, but the rhythm feels familiar. Couples pass each other with glances rich in subtext. An old woman tucks a sprig of mint into a bride's veil. A child plays with a carved scarab, unaware of its ancient meaning. The traces are everywhere. Words first. Many Egyptian phrases of love and affection have descendants in Arabic expressions today. Terms of endearment, poetic turns of phrase, they've evolved, but the spirit of ancient intimacy lives on in how people still write love letters, how they bless newlyweds, how lullabies are sung to babies under the stars. You walk into a perfumery. The shelves are lined with oils, blue lotus, frankincense, cinnamon. These are the same scents that once soaked into temple floors during rituals to Hathor. Today, people wear them for allure, for calm, or just to feel good. The connection may be unconscious, but it's real. Cosmetics too, remember the kohl? That thick black eyeliner wasn't just for flair. It protected eyes from glare and infections, yes, but it also carried spiritual weight. It survives today in eyeliner across the Middle East and North Africa, even called by similar names, kajal, kola, surma. And fertility beliefs? You peek inside a small home where a woman is placing an amulet beneath her pillow. It's not a croc dung paste or a lettuce offering, but it's rooted in that same timeless wish, hope for life. Even if the modern tools have changed, the human heart hasn't. We still whisper to unseen powers. We still long, pray, prepare. You stop at a tourist market. Among the papyrus bookmarks and ceramic cats, you spot something unusual. A replica of the Turin erotic papyrus, neatly folded and labeled. Ancient Kama Sutra. You chuckle. That's not what it was. But it reminds you how even now, we're trying to decipher Egypt's sensual secrets. Sometimes wrong. Sometimes half right. Always curious. Fashion echoes remain too. Gold collars, linen draping, anklets that jingle when you walk, all once signs of courtship or fertility or divine favor. Now, festival wear. Music video inspiration. Egyptian beauty has circled the globe and settled quietly in pop culture, sometimes unnoticed. And the gods? Oh, they're quiet now. But Bess still appears on lucky keychains. Tauret pops up in cartoons. Isis has been reborn in songs, brands, and even superhero lore. Their forms have shifted, but their essence, playful, powerful, protective, still draws people in. You sip sweet tea beside a modern couple. The woman laughs as the man offers her a date, and for a moment, you could swear you're watching a scene from 3,000 years ago. Just dressed differently. Because here's the truth, the ancient Egyptians didn't just invent temples and pyramids. They helped shape how we love. They showed the world that pleasure can be sacred. That desire doesn't have to clash with dignity. That intimacy, in its many forms, can outlast empires. They taught us that a glance can be a prayer. That a kiss might carry you through the afterlife. That love, even messy, jealous, imperfect love, is worth carving in stone. As you walk one last time along the Nile, you glance at your reflection in the water. You see someone different now. Someone who's laughed with gods, danced in temples, whispered love spells, and peeked into the bedroom of history. And all of it, every ounce of joy and awkwardness and sacred sensuality, is part of you now. You're ready to go home. But not before one last exhale. You lie back beneath the stars, the desert breeze slipping across your skin like silk. The sounds of ancient laughter, of temple drums, of whispered spells, grow fainter now, fading into the sand. You let the stories soften. You let the images blur. No more golden walls or fragrant oils. No more hieroglyphic giggles or crocodile-based contraception. Just a slow, warm sense of having traveled, not just through time, but through human connection. The world you visited was sensual, yes, but also sincere. So deeply human. People loved, ached, longed, healed. They dressed their desires in linen and lined their tombs with promises of reunion. And even now, across millennia, you can feel them, not as mummies or myths, but as people. People like you. You take a slow breath. You made it through the festivals, the fig-based flirting, the hippo talismans and bedtime incantations. You survived the crocodile, the cursed threats, the awkward papyri. And somehow, you leave this place not overwhelmed, but comforted. Because if ancient Egypt knew anything, it's this: desire is not a danger, it's a rhythm. A pulse. A song the soul hums as it moves through life. And now that song grows quieter. Your limbs get heavy. The Nile turns to mist. Even the gods yawn once. And as your eyes close, a whisper from the past wraps you like linen. You are whole. You are worthy. You are loved. Sweet dreams.